Oh, welcome back. So if there's one thing that you should know about me, it's that I am in fact a hater. And there's nothing I hate more in this world than new build houses and developments. So recently I've been having kind of a bit of a rough period. And when I have a rough period, I like to go walking. I like the sun against my cheeks, the birds singing, and all of these things help me from going insane. These walks are part of my mental health. And on my walks, there was this house, this cute little 1920s-ish build house that had a lot of character. It was a little dilapidated, but nonetheless, it was a cute little house. Well, a few months back, this little tiny charming house got demolished. Personally, I was a little bit sad that this first house had been demolished, but I thought that the builder must have this riveting, inspirational vision for what they wanted to do with this plot. So I went on vacation, and when I came back, I was met with the horrifying, disgusting, odious abomination of a house. The windows were all out of whack, scattered across the facade without any rhyme nor reason. There was weird wood paneling through on the side, as almost if it was an afterthought. The trim was black, the house stark white. The whole thing was an ugly eyesore next to the classic neighbors. This, I thought, was a neighborhood tragedy. However, I stay in my lane, and that's frankly none of my business. But I keep walking, and lo and behold, I stumble across a similar monstrosity with the personality of what I would describe as white bread. Then another, and another. Still another plot ready for the same fate. Everywhere I went on this walk, suddenly it felt like every house with charming character had been demolished in favor of these monster houses of monstrosity. Much like a disease, these houses devoid of character and all looking like if Studio McGee and Magnolia Homes went into real estate have slowly started infecting the suburban landscape across the country. Although not known for being the most distinctive area of the United States, the suburbs are starting to be fraught with these flipping developers. To add insult to injury, these developers are not just merely making these visually uninteresting and sometimes downright ugly houses, they are also destabilizing communities, driving home prices way up, and creating strife among neighbors. And personally, these homes just piss me off. So I am here to figure out why homes nowadays are so ugly. And before we actually dive in, I just want to give a quick disclaimer, especially if you live in a house like the ones I'm about to show, or you feel like this might be a house that you are interested in. Please know that this is just my opinion. It's just my personal one-sided beef with these developments and the type of housing. Again, these are just my opinions and a little bit of facts sprinkled in to kind of color my opinions. If you like your home, I love that for you. And I mean, I don't even have a home, so you have a leg up on me. So with that out of the way, let's jump in. So to start us off, I think it would be important to understand the context and the history of suburbia and examine how suburban households and suburban landscape came into existence. So the suburbs have become such an integral part to the American experience and the American landscape, it's a bit wild to consider that suburbs used to not be a thing, or at least not in the way we conceptualize them today. For large swaths of human history, it was most advantageous for survival of humans to congregate together. By forming cities and towns that foster community, humans could stave off predators, collect shared resources, and raise each other up. Although people did exist on homesteads outside the traditional confines of cities, this was risky and left people vulnerable. But as the population of the US grew, cities began to swell and expand into surrounding lands. Naturally, cities developed outlying areas of housing and communities formed within the fringes of these cities. However, prior to the 1940s and 1950s, those areas of suburban sprawl were relatively small and close to the cities that they outlined. However, this all changed in the 1900s. Now, there are a number of different and complex factors that contributed to the birth of the suburban explosion. However, I will try to explain just the major few that contribute to this boom in suburbia. So if you're unaware, in the beginning of the 1940s, America was involved in a little thing called World War II. During this time, almost all industries were focused on the war effort, helped lead America out of an economic depression that had impacted the late 20s and 30s. War is unfortunately a profitable business. This economic boom, coupled with a general sense of elation following a victory at war, resulted in the baby boom. If you've ever heard of the word boomer or people being referred to as boomers, matters, it actually comes from this generation of children that were born after the World War. This increase in family size resulted in a significant shortage of houses in metropolitan areas. Returning soldiers needed not only support with demobilization from the war, but also support in finding housing for their rapidly growing families. This is where Uncle Sam decided to step in and pass the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, otherwise known as the GI Bill. Now, you may be vaguely aware of this bill because it was pretty influential and has impacted the landscape of the United States in the late 1900s and even till today, especially if you're military or military affiliated. This bill was meant to help American soldiers as they demobilized from serving in the Army and help them adjust to the civilian world by assisting them with employment, education, and housing. Although all of those facets are interesting and certainly impacted the economic makeup of the United States, we will be primarily focused on the impact of the GI Bill on housing post-World War II. Specifically, the GI Bill helped veteran servicemen by subsidizing and offering them federal aid to buy homes. Because of this assistance, veterans were able to afford and buy bigger homes for their families in the suburbs, slowly increasing the suburban population. But these veterans were only able to live in the suburbs thanks to technological advancements that made it easier. Two of the biggest technological advancements that impacted the creation of the suburban housing landscape came from the same man. Now, I am a Henry Ford hater. If Henry Ford has any haters, I'm one of them. If he has none, I am dead. If you have no idea why I'm a Henry Ford hater, I would recommend you looking him up. Although there's a lot of complicated and complex history behind this man, it is undoubted that this man, Henry Ford, has an indelible impact on American advancements in technological advancements. For one, Henry Ford's revolutionary approach to car building made cars more affordable for the average American. The ability to access personal vehicles and not rely on public transportation was a huge reason for the success of the suburbs. People could now move further away from the metropolitan areas where their work was usually located and not have to worry about relying on public transit to get them back home. People could now taxi themselves back and forth from the city to the suburbs, which allowed the suburban expansion. In addition to revolutionizing the auto industry, Henry Ford also inspired the housing industry with his approach to car building. Ford's novel approach, called the assembly line, allowed people to quickly and efficiently churn out automobiles while also allowing Ford to overwork and underpay his workers. Seeing the success of the assembly line in the auto industry, housing developers saw how the principles could be applied to creating housing for suburban housing developments. One of the most notable examples of this assembly line model applying to modern suburban houses is the housing development called Levittown in Levittown, New York. The developer of this suburban housing development, Levitt and Sons construction firm, were able to utilize the principles of assembly lines to produce and manufacture similar looking cookie cutter houses to develop a subdivision of housing clone. According to sources, Levitt and Sons followed a series of 27 steps, which meant each house was built following the exact same orders, meaning that each house was almost in essence the exact same, with the exact same features down to the landscape planted outside of their home. And as with the automobile industry, the assembly line method to the housing development was incredibly effective, with Levitt and Sons able to transform a former potato farm to a community with more than 82,000 people within the span of a decade. The final reason that the suburbs really expanded in the 1950s and 60s was this concept of white flight. I'll only mention this briefly because there's a lot more research and literature about the white flight, and I would encourage you to go find those resources and really look those up. But the white flight is a phenomenon where white people who lived within the confines of cities and metropolitan areas started to move to the suburbs to kind of avoid the urbanization and the influx of people of color into the metropolitan areas. It is a racial response and is associated pretty heavily with segregation and is an interesting and compelling topic to just delve into if you have the time. So those major reasons contributed to this suburban sprawl that we see today in the US landscape. Each one of them had a significant and profound impact in the way that the suburban landscape developed and how the composition of the landscape in the suburban sprawl looks today. So now that we've discussed the rise of the suburban sprawl, you may be thinking, well, suburbia was never that beautiful. The houses were all lacking in a bit of character. And while I hear you, I still want to discuss what I call the HGTV-ification of the suburban sprawl. Now, I love HGTV. I mean, when I'm in a hotel room, HGTV is the first thing I flip on. Either that or the Food Network. Guy Fieri, you have my heart. Guy's Grocery Games, you are forever a hotel room staple. But I think that there is a lot to be criticized when it comes to HGTV and its impact on suburbia and the way that people conceptualize flipping houses. Anyway, for those who may not know, HGTV, formerly called the Home Lawn and Garden Channel, is the home of all things home renovation and real estate. Some of their top shows are things like The Property Brothers, Love It or List It, House Hunters, and Hometowns, which I honestly love the people from Hometown, and they are just iconic. Love them. It has always been a very popular channel, but experienced a precipitous rise in popularity as a certain generation started growing into their adulthood. Millennials love themselves some HGTV. One of the types of shows that HGTV loves to produce were house flipping shows. And this is really like the crux of the issue and kind of like what I hypothesize is at the root of why a lot of these houses are the way that they are now is this phenomena of house flipping. So if you're unfamiliar, house flipping is basically where people buy up properties with the intention of renovating and then putting them back on the market for a higher value. The concept of flipping houses has been around for a pretty long time, longer than I initially thought, with some of the first house flippings taking place in the late 1980s. But the concept of flipping houses really rose to prominence in the early 2000s, with the height of the popularity being in 2005. According to data, in 2005, 8.2% of all single-family houses were being bought and flipped. That's an absurd amount in the US. During this time, shows like Flip This House on A&E, Flipping Out on Bravo were popular. People were also marketing flipping houses as a good way to make income and make a living. I mean, I remember going to different kinds of convention centers and there would always be like a seminar about how to buy and flip houses for a profit. However, house flipping comes at a cost. See, what happens with flipping is that you can create a housing bubble. Now, bear with me as I try to kind of stumble through some of this like more intensive economic theory. I'm going to try to dumb it down, but honestly, it's kind of over my head as well. So during the early 2000s, it was really easy to receive a loan. Too easy. People without the means to pay off their loans or mortgages were able to obtain loans, especially housing loans. Additionally, the federal government was heavily incentivizing people during this time to buy and develop homes by cutting interest rates. However, as people bought and developed houses, they raised the prices of these homes. Eventually, the mortgage was readjusted and the economy slowed down. What happened is that people who were buying houses at one price and were given loans for those houses to buy up those houses and eventually sell them or like just have them in order to flip them and sell them off, could no longer afford to pay back these mortgages because the houses just weren't selling at the prices that they used to because the economy readjusted and the houses went down. So basically, people were no longer able to sell these homes and they couldn't recoup what they paid and were essentially breaking loans and unable to pay back the loans that they were given, essentially creating a real estate bubble. Now, again, this is just the basics and there's a lot more to it than this, but if you really want to consult like the literature, the gold standard, and you really want to get into it, I suggest looking into The Big Short. Love that movie. It condenses it and does like a dummy's guide to the housing bubble in 2008. But another thing that contributed to this real estate bubble were the flippers. Flippers were able to buy houses at one price and sell them to buyers who should not have been able to buy them at an extremely inflated price. And when someone sells a house at a price way higher than the homes around it, it destabilizes the market around that home. Additionally, some flippers were able to buy homes and not able to sell them, creating empty homes. And flippers with large loans were unable to pay them off because they weren't able to sell the homes with the intention of paying off that loan. The whole thing was a flippin' mess. And so flipping was another contributor to the housing crash in 2008. People who had once seen the flipping industry as a surefire way to create profit suddenly had to retreat and lick their wounds. But time would pass, the recession would ease, and people would simply forget the errors of their ways and go back to flipping. Namely, HGTV forgot that flipping as a concept concept was a major factor in the destabilization of the market and only saw flipping as higher ratings and more money for their channel. And in the 2010s, HGTV ventured back into the flipping space and launched the whole new flippin' TV-verse. Although the early 2000s saw a big boom in house flipping throughout the US, I think the 2010s were really the house flipping renaissance. During these golden years of house flipping, there were more house flipping TV shows than ever before. Thanks to the absolute juggernaut of the house renovation TV shows, HGTV throwing their hat into the rink with hit shows like Flip or Flop, Property Brothers, Hometown, and more, house flipping revolution was alive and well. And side note, as an avid HGTV fan, I literally hated Flip or Flop and was really happy that it went up in flames. So sorry about their marriage, hated Flip or Flop. You could just tell that those two just hated each other. But with the rise of these TV shows came the rejuvenation of flipping culture. They were ushering a whole new generation in to enjoy the spoils of the flipping fortune, millennials. Now, I want to preface this conversation by saying that millennials are often used by the media as a scapegoat and are constantly given shit for almost every choice in their life since the moment they were born. And while I am sympathetic to their plight, and I do think that they are often unfairly maligned, I do think that they are partially, if not fully, to blame in the rise of popularity of flipping in the 2010s till now. So, like their predecessors before them, millennials started buying up older homes and flipping them for a profit. And this leads us to the point of this video and the real reason why homes are ugly today. Although this is a very complex issue, I think it can be broken down into flippers on a development scale and flippers on a more localized scale. So on the one side, we have developers tearing down the older homes with more character, charm, and aesthetics and replacing them with large, white, modern monster homes. A lot of these homes that are being torn down are smaller residences that were bought at a time when the value of the land was significantly cheaper and people with lower incomes could afford to live in these areas. But as time progressed and cities expanded or grew, the land that these houses sat on became more and more valuable, eventually eclipsing the value of the home on it. Therefore, when the residents decided to sell for a number of reasons, or that the developers decided to come in with an offer that they simply could not refuse, these properties began to be bought up. For these developers, it was easier to demolish the homes that sat on the land and rebuild than it was to try to keep that home and renovate it on the property. Hence, these developers started destroying the smaller homes, instead favoring to build larger, more expensive homes so that they could make a profit. As I mentioned before, when you increase the selling price of the home in an area or in a neighborhood, you actually destabilize the housing market in that area, making it increasingly more and more expensive. Eventually, the neighborhood, once full of homes that were affordable, is now filled of mini mansions that are too expensive for the families that used to live there. This gradual gentrification of the area eventually leads to pricing people out from whole sections of cities and driving them further away from the desirable areas. On top of the destabilization and gentrification, these developers also decide to make some of the ugliest houses and denigrating the poor neighborhoods that they choose to invade. And why make these houses hideous and ugly? White, beige monstrosities made of materials that look very cheap? Well, if you guessed capitalism, then you would be correct. It's always capitalism. In essence, these developers wanted to create the houses quickly and as cheaply as possible in order to turn around and make the highest return on investment. So they make these poorly constructed and ugly looking homes, blah aesthetics, because it's easier and cheaper than constructing a house with style and character. And let me be clear, these houses are not ugly because they are modern, because modern houses usually have a thoughtful design to them. I think that the way that they are ugly is because they seem so purposeless, and the architectural design to a lot of these houses just seems to be completely lacking. These homes are the aesthetic equivalent of Studio McGee at Target, appealing to beige, crisp, and white stylings that are generally pleasing to a target demographic for home buyers in this decade who are largely elder millennials that like that sad beige baby effect. In general, I think the stylistic elements of these homes beckon to a specific type of person and are incredibly dated by the time that they are already built. It is just an architectural style that doesn't seem to have as much lasting power as some of the other ones we've seen in the previous decades. Personal beef aside, the real crime of these developments is the gentrification and the impact on the housing market and the the city landscape. On the other side of the flipping market, you have the localized flippers. These are the flippers who may not have the budget that the large real estate developers have, but they have just enough extra income to take out a loan on a house and that they intend to renovate. Encouraged by these house flipping TV shows that they've seen, these type of house flippers largely focus on small fixes, generally sticking to more of the aesthetic details and only renovating bigger items when absolutely necessary, or more likely just painting over them and doing a landlord special. And this is really where the issue with these localized flippers come into play, because a lot of these flippers don't really have an idea of how expensive and how time consuming these house flipping projects can actually be. Most flippers buy a house with the dreams of making money, and then after buying these houses are confronted with the real struggles of properly flipping a home. It's not always as easy as just changing a few details, but most flippers find that there are usually really intensive issues with the homes that they buy that require the work and the time that they frankly just don't have. Therefore, a lot of the flippers don't actually commit to making the proper flipping details. They instead want to only do the few cosmetic fixes that they think would actually make the house marketable without actually investigating or fixing the integral parts of the house that need to be fixed to actually call it a proper flip. This is why you get a lot of compilations of before and after shots where people absolutely butcher houses to make them look different and more modern and more to a certain aesthetic, instead of actually meaningfully flipping the house and addressing some of the underlying issues of the house. And this would all be fine if they weren't listing these houses at extremely high prices, once again completely destabilizing the housing markets around them. Additionally, people love to flip homes into Airbnbs, and there are so many issues with Airbnb. If you haven't dug into the issues with the short-term rental properties and everything going on with that, I highly encourage you taking a look. It's fascinating, but a lot of flippers usually rent out these Airbnbs to people who may not respect the area, respect the neighborhood, or just empty most of the time, which again, in a housing crisis like we have right now in the United States, having a bunch of empty properties simply doesn't make sense. And I think, again, this is the crux of the issue and the kind of conclusion that I want to draw with these houses. Yes, do I think that these houses are butt ugly? Yeah. I think that they are stylistically devoid of any inspiration and are just kind of thrown together haphazardly for the prices that they're listed for. You would expect a little bit more architectural integrity. But I think that the bigger crime with a lot of these suburban houses is the destabilization of the housing markets. Not only are these houses, again, these ugly monstrosities that actually butt up against some of the neighbors that they are next to, but they're ugly on the outside as well, creating housing bubbles and housing instability. In general, the cosmetic issues would be bad enough, but also creating the housing instability that we're experiencing in the United States is truly despicable. The argument that these houses are ruining the character and the culture of the neighborhoods is also well taken. Although one could say that suburbia was never really a character-driven conceptual framework in terms of the houses are kind of cookie cutter. They've always been. At least there was kind of a cohesive design in mind with a lot of the neighborhood developments that we saw in suburbia. Now, a lot of the houses are being completely demolished that used to be easily accessible for people and are being replaced by these huge monstrosities, completely butchering the cohesiveness of the neighborhood. And additionally, you're bringing in people of different demographics and different kinds of cultural ideals into neighborhoods that have existed for a very long time. So there's a lot of things that happen when you completely demolish and flip a house into this new build that just kind of disrupts the flow of the community and the neighborhood. But at the end of the day, I think this all comes down to personal preference and what you think is aesthetically pleasing. Some people might think that these houses actually add to the landscape and create more of a cohesive neighborhood. However, I believe these houses are just plain ugly and also represent the woes of capitalism. But that is all I have for you. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.